Greetings hobbyists, this is Adds Ons, and in this video we're making a dragon hide shield. So we'll do this in two parts, making the general shape of the shield, and then we'll do the dragon scaling in the second part. So if you're only interested in one of those bits, for example the dragon scales, feel free to skip forward to that point. So for the general shape, I'm just going to bring in a cube. I want this to be about 1.5mm thick, so you might as well stick that in as the general size of the shield. And then I'm just going to come to item, and then I want the height to be somewhere in the region of 28mm, and then I want the width to be about 19.5. So we've got that generally about correct. Now we're going to start beveling these corners, so let's Shift and A and apply the scale, otherwise that's going to go horribly wrong. Go into edge mode, click the edge, Shift and G, and then select the similar lengths, Control and B, and then I'm going to press C so we clamp on those points. And then scroll up, I'm just going to hit S to control the segment number and put 128, so we've got that really nice and round without any faceting. Now, I don't want this to be as perfectly rounded as this. I want it to be a bit flatter. I mean, it's not really flat. I just want the spherical shape to be a bit squished. So I'm just going to go into vertex mode. Let's go into X-ray mode, select those, Shift and S. This pie menu comes from Machine Tools. Go to vert, you can do that using normal methods as well, and then I'm just going to change the transform method to the 3D cursor, select all the vertices, S and Z, and then I can shrink that up slightly. That looks a bit good, maybe a bit less than that. Let's go with somewhere around there. Then I can press Alt and X, and that's using Mesh Machine to symmetrize. So we will use some add-ons for this because it's going to make life a lot easier, but all of this you could do with general tools. It's just a much slower process. If you are interested in any of these add-ons, I've got links to all of them in the description. We're going to be using Machine Tools, Mesh Machine, and Hard Ops. I would say of all of those, Machine Tools is a bargain because of how cheap it is and so many tools. And Hard Ops and Box Cutter are always great. Mesh Machine you could do manually, it just takes a lot more time, so it's just going to be a bit faster to show it this way. Right, at this point let's Shift and S and then move the cursor back to the origin, and then we're going to go to Object Mode, Shift and A, and bring in another cube, and we'll cut out these side parts. So let's scale that up to be a bit bigger, G and then X to bring it off to the side, and then let's S and Z to somewhere around there. Let's just type in 9.5 to give it an exact amount, and then Control and A, apply the scale, and then we'll bevel these edges. Let's go somewhere around there, have a look at how that looks. Yeah, about there's right. Shift click there, Control X, and then we'll mirror this using Hard Ops. You could do that manually if you want, and then Control and minus to cut those out. Do I like that shape? Let's go somewhere around there. And then H to hide that. Now thinking about this, I've done this a bit wrong. So what I'm going to do is actually Shift and D to make a duplicate of this, and then we'll press M and move it to a new collection which we'll call inner, because I want to use this for the inside. Let's just hide that whole collection and we can go back to this. So using Hard Ops, I'm going to apply these really quickly using Smart Apply. You can apply everything in your modifier panel as normal, and then I'm going to go into face mode, select there. Oh, we're going to have some overlapping points here, so let's just hit 3 to get rid of those. That's going to deal with the overlapping points from the beveling. That's using the cleanup tool from Machine Tools. Select, Shift select here, and then I'm going to I to inset this to make my edging on the shield, and I think we want to go with about 1.5, so I'll just type that in. Now we're going to have a massive problem here with a load of overlaps. We could do this all manually, but using Mesh Machine, I'm going to click there, Control click on that edge to select all of these edges. I'm going to go to Y, un-FCK, and that's going to allow me to fix this. And we could do this really perfectly, but I'm actually just going to hit M so that we've got that all going to one point. This does mean that we can't now Control and R and do a edge loop all the way around, but for what I need, that's not going to be necessary. And actually this sharp edge here is going to look great. Let's just mirror that across. So I'm going to Alt X across that way and then Alt X that way. That's using Symmetrize with Mesh Machine. You could Symmetrize using the tools with the Mesh and Symmetrize if you wanted to. And then I'm going to Alt select there and then G and then Y that back to about there. So yeah, about 1mm back. And then we've got that. And I think that adds a really nice, interesting shape to this. Oh, I just realised we didn't sort out these edges here. I should have done that earlier and then just symmetrised in that direction. But again, with Mesh Machine, that takes seconds, so really easy. And then we'll symmetrise there and there, and we're all good to go. Go into face mode, select this face and that face, Control and E, and then we're going to bridge edge loops. And now we've got our outside detailing, and I think that's going to look really cool. Let's bring back our inner part, which we can see here, and we're going to want to shrink this down. So let's just scale that in to the point where it's about there. Go something like that. And then we're going to scale that on the y-axis. So that's S and Y, bring that in a bit, and then just G and then Y that back. So we've got a little bit of a dip down where that's going on. Now what's useful about this is because we copied it, once we've done our Boolean, we've still got the Boolean active, so I can bring back my cutter here, or I could just use Everscroll with hard ops, and then let's let's turn that off, our 3D cursor, so that's S to scale that up a bit, G, and then X that there. That should be enough. This is going to need to be scaled in. We can see we've got an overlap here, so let's S and then X that a bit more. Is that right? Yep, that looks pretty much perfect. Let's just do a little bit on the Z-axis. There we go. That should be great. H to hide that, and we've got our basic shield shape. Now, if that's all you want for your shield, that's fairly good to go, but I don't like this being perfectly flat. I want it to have a slightly domed shape to it. So what I'm going to do is add to this. You'll notice I have not applied this modifier of these cutouts because we might need that in a second. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a load of information here. So basically, divide this up and then pull out the center section. So I'm going to apply the scale. That shouldn't really make too much of a difference here because it does it off of the sizing anyway. But I'm going to dice this using hard ops. So I'm going to press Q, mesh tools, and then dice. And then at the moment it's just working on this axis. If I press Z, it'll work on the Z as well. Scroll that up to somewhere, I don't know, about here. We want it pretty dense because we're going to sculpt on this in a bit anyway. So I'm going to go to about 120, click. And then now we can see we've got all of these faces on here. And what I can do is just select, let's say, some middle ones. I'm not going to be too precise with this because I'll symmetrize it in a second. And we're going to sculpt on this, so it's not going to be too much of a problem. Come to my proportional editing. We could either do this smooth or we could do it on sphere. Let's have a look how sphere looks. And then just G and then Y. And then I'm going to scroll up. And we'll have something like that. Do I like this? We'll have a look. Okay, somewhere to about there. So it's got a bit of a dome to it. Now, what's actually happening here is that because it's doing it by distance, I've actually selected this a little bit too wide, I would say. So if I come back here and reselect this and make a much more thinner selection, so that's G and then Y that out, you can see it's going to affect less of the shape. I'm not sure about this round. I think smooth's better. Yeah, that's giving a much nicer result. So let's come back to about there, dome it out to about there. You'll see that's also affected the back, which is great because it gives us some space to put in our hand. And then we've got that good to go. Now, we're just going to have to fiddle around with this here. You can see now we can see it a little bit more. So let's just bring back that cutter. So Q, Everscroll, or we could have gone over there. And then just G and then X that across a bit. There we go, H. And we've got our shield. Now at this point, let's just check nothing was in the wrong place. So, yep, we have got enough of a gap there that this is going to boolean together correctly. That's really, really important. And then I'm just going to QQ and smart apply. And if we wanted to, we could go into vertex mode, Alt and X, and make sure that everything is pretty much symmetrical, which is probably worth doing. And we can do this in both axes. So there we go, pretty good to go. So let's get on with our dragon hide. So we're going to use some tricks for this, including some which are fairly basic, and we'll talk through those, but also some that I haven't really seen mentioned much. In fact, there's one of them that I don't think I've seen at all, which is a trick with one of the sculpting tools which will allow us to make better spines. So hopefully you're going to find that quite fun. But the first thing we need to do is actually get this much more detailed. Now, what I'm going to do is go into edge mode, and then I'm going to select all of this edge here. Now, you'll notice I'm not having a problem with this because I've got Mesh Machine, which does a really cool trick where you can click and then Alt click, and it will work out things even with these horrible parts that shouldn't be. Let's just unselect that one. Should not be something that you can select really quickly. So it really speeds things up using this loop select tool. So once again with Mesh Machine, that is you click, hold down Alt and then click again on that edge, and it will select what feels like should be something that's impossible to select using Blender's normal Alt select, because, well, these aren't quads, they're horrible in many ways. So let's do that there, and then click, and then there. And sometimes it does get confused and it's selecting that middle part there. There we go. And then we're just going to select that edge, and the same here. And then on the other side as well. And that's going to allow me to Shift and E up that crease, and then I can still come in, add modifier, and then subdivision surface. And I can subdivide this to make it a lot smoother, but without affecting this outer edge. So let's go somewhere about there. Now I could use the simple division, but I find this standard one works better with creases when you've got these non-N-gon edges. And then QQ, Smart Apply, and then we've got this really dense mesh that we can then come in and start sculpting on. So to sculpt our scales, we've got a couple of options. I'll cover both and we'll do them one at a time. I'm not going to cover the whole shield because it would just take too much time and just be repetitive, so that's just going to be a bit boring. Let's T to open our tool panel and drag that out so we've got information on our tools, and I'm going to tab and go into sculpt mode. If you don't have machine tools, we just come up here, sculpt mode, and we've got all our brushes with their names. Now for this, we're going to really want to be using the mask brush. So I'm going to come down to mask brush here. I'm going to up the strength all the way to 1 so we get a really solid mask. Now I've gone really high on this vertex count because I know my computer can take it. You might need to go a little bit lower. Just play around with what your computer can handle. So of the two techniques, this one is probably my favorite. It just gives a result I prefer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mask off some sort of shapes, so things like this, and just color it in each time so it's fully masked. And then I'm just going to do another section. In fact, that's really too big. Let's just go somewhere about here. Do that again. And this is a bit small, so I'm going to F to create a larger brush. So we've got something like that, and then we're just going to do several other spots. So I might want a smaller one here. Now importantly, I'm going to make sure there is a gap between each of these. If you mess this up and there isn't a perfect gap between them, we can fix this, but that's the sort of shapes that I want. And if I want this sort of central spine, I might do a larger one in the middle so that I've got that. You'll notice that the more you zoom in, the less blurred this outline. So if you want a sharper outline, you can just zoom in more and go in and define that outline a bit more. And this will give you slightly different results. So let's zoom in a lot here, do one there, and then we can talk through how this works. Let's do another one here. So importantly, make sure you've got a gap between each of these scales. You can do these as rounded or as geometric or like polygons as you want. That's entirely up to you. But once you're done, we're just going to press Ctrl and I to invert the mask. So we've now got that done. And if you do ever want to draw some mask in, so for example, here, I might continue drawing there and then just redefine that edge, or make this a little bit wider, the gap between those two there. Now, what I like about this technique is it gives some gaps between them, and I find that looks a little bit more natural. Then we're just going to go scrolling down to our mesh filter, make sure that we've got inflate selected, and then we can just click and drag, and it's going to inflate those bits that we've got selected. You'll notice that sometimes your mask might not have been totally perfect here, so we can always go to the smooth brush, which is just there, and then just smooth that out to get rid of those bits that don't look quite perfect. So that's the first technique in getting our scales. Now if we just press Alt and M, it's going to completely get rid of that mask, and we'll show the other one over here. Once we've got this mask brush, what I'm going to do is press Alt and I to mask everything, and what I'm going to do is hold Control, which does the opposite of masking off. So I'm going to unmask this section. Now, in reality, what you'd probably do is unmask a larger amount of this, and then we're going to start masking off our shapes. So I'm going to F to make that smaller, and then we can just draw in our edges around this. In fact, that's probably a bit big. Let's just F and make that a bit smaller, and we can start drawing in these shapes. Now, this is quite useful for creating these quite polygon-shaped patterns, so this works really well for that. It's also quite quick to draw them in. You can still create little gaps or larger gaps between them, so I can fill that bit in there if I wanted to. I will say this works really well for certain types of outline. For example, this is a bit more controllable in terms of where all of the different shapes are, but I find it makes it a little bit more predictable and not quite as interesting as these. But it's very good for, let's say, if you wanted to do something like a turtle shell. I think that'd be quite interesting done in this technique. But this allows you to create quite tight patterns. So I'm just upping the speed on this so you can see the process in this section. Then exactly the same thing again, we're going to go into our mesh filter, inflate is on, and just click and drag and make those larger. So you've got several options and they do create slightly different results. I generally prefer this technique here. So I've undone the other side, and then we're going to talk about some other things that we can do to these shapes. So the first is, depending on the scales that you want, you might want sharper and more defined edges. For that, we're going to use the crease brush, which is here. You can also press Shift and C to make that start. I'm going to F to make that a bit bigger. And if we try and crease here, it's going to create quite an ugly effect. What I do is hold Control and then crease, and it does almost like the opposite, and it creates a nice, more defined outline. And I quite like the look of that for certain type of scales, and it almost raises this edge slightly up so you have a slight indent in the middle. I think that looks quite nice. It does depend on what you want. If you've gone too far, you can always either use the smooth brush or hold down Shift while you click, and that automatically activates the smooth brush. So it's just going to smooth things out slightly. So that's quite a nice approach as well. The final thing that I wanted to mention is making these larger spines. And I haven't really seen this covered much. I'll show you the technique that I have seen covered, which I think there's a better way of doing this result. So what we're going to do is once again use the mask brush. So scroll down to mask, and we're going to mask off this central bit. Then we're going to Control and I, and again invert our mask, and standard wisdom would say that we want to use the snake hook brush, F to make that larger, and we can just drag this out and we make our horn, which looks quite nice, or our spine. So I can do that there. Now, the only thing with this is, if we just do this again, is I find it creates something that's, well, very rounded. And sometimes I want something a bit more angular. Now, what we can do for this is actually change the fall off. And this will give a different effect, especially if we had something with the more angular edges. I'll show that in a second. So instead of having smooth, I'm actually going to go to linear. We're going to do exactly the same thing, and hopefully you'll notice there's a difference. So if I drag out there, you can see it's still rounded, but it just creates a little bit more of an interesting shape. I quite like this. I think it looks a bit more extreme, and we can just, again, hold down the Shift button to smooth, and I don't know, it just seems a little bit better in terms of this shape. The other thing that this is really good for, if I just Alt and M and totally start again, so let's M to bring up the mask brush, F to bring that down and do something quite angular. So let's go with, let's say there, just sort of like a square or a diamond shape. Control and I to do that again, and then we'll come to a snake hook tool. We can also use K for that, F to make that bigger, and then just drag this out. And I don't know, I just think it gives a much better result having this fall off being linear than using the standard fall off, which is smooth. Maybe there's not that much in it, it's not hugely noticeable, but I do think it just gives a better result. Now from this point on, what we can do once again is start smoothing this out. Okay, I normally Alt and M to get rid of the mask because otherwise it can cause some problems. Notice that where we did this from the mask without there being this part, it's created a very hard seam, whereas I quite like this here where it's a bit more gradual because of the work we did earlier. We can smooth this out, and then we can, if we want to, move things around. So I'm going to press G to start the grab brush, F to make that a bit smaller, and we can just start fiddling around with the shape slightly and then smoothing until we get the sort of spine that we might want. If we do ever get to the point where this has got too little geometry, we can always remesh it if we want to. But importantly, this is where if I Shift and C to bring back the crease brush can really come in. And I normally use this to just enhance some of the shape that's normally here. And again, I'm going to hold down Control, drag here, up to the tip, and we're going to get this nice, interesting sort of crease. We could have these twisted round. I could do that in a more extreme way. So let's just go sort of there and really have some twist to this. So something like that, and you do that several times, and this looks really interesting. Maybe something like a unicorn horn if you want that sort of look, or we can just accentuate the shapes that are already there. So let's just crease that bit up there. I'm just going to smooth that out a little bit at the tip by holding down Shift and left clicking so it's a bit more gradual, and then we'll do another one here. So again, Control and click, Shift click to smooth, just to get something that looks a little bit more interesting and a bit more gradiated. We'll do another one here. Shift click there, and then another one here. And then Shift click to slightly smooth that out. And we get these much more organic looking horns that really suit this sort of dragony, bony armor. Once you have got to the point where you're happy with all of your spines, if you want to have them, let's add some rivets around the outside of the shield just to show how it's all bolted together. So I'm going to shift to a mesh and I'm going to bring in a quad sphere. You could use a UV sphere or an icosphere if you want. The quad sphere comes with machine tools. Let's up that to 5 so it's quite smooth, though we possibly don't need it. Bear in mind how small this is going to be. And then let's just G and then Z that down to somewhere around here. S until we get it to about the right size. I'm just going to N and bring out my item so I know how big this is. I want this to be about 0.8 millimeters, so that looks about right. I'm going to go into side view and just get it so that the origin, which is a nice gauge for the center point, is approximately on the outside line of our mesh. Now that looks a little bit off center, so once again let's just G and down that. When I say off center, I mean not quite in the middle of this line, though it's difficult to tell from the angle. Then I'm just going to make a duplicate of that, so Shift and D and drag it to approximately here. Let's Alt and X to mirror this across that object, so we've got one on both sides, and then I'll Shift and D and do one more here, and then I can check if I think that looks about right. Let's G that to about there. We could do this more precisely if we use something like geometry nodes, but I think for this project that should be about fine. Yeah, that looks good. And then let's have a look at this one here. Maybe a little bit more there. And then we've got our rivets. I'm just going to select each of those, select here, and then Alt and X, and then mirror to the top as well. And I think we're good to go. Do I want one in the center here? Maybe. So let's Shift and D that. We'll get rid of one of the mirrors, so we don't need the mirror in the Z axis. And then let's Alt and A to use machine tools align. I'm just going to do it in the Z to make sure it's perfectly centered. And then let's just G and X that across to where we need it to be. G, Shift and Z so it can't move any further on the Z axis because we know it's perfectly in the middle. And yeah, there. Great. So I'm going to leave this here because the model that I've got already has a handle on the hand, so I'm not wanting to create the handle for this shield. And this video is already starting to get a little long as it is, and people have a tendency to not want videos longer than 20-25 minutes. So there we've got our dragon shield with additional central spines. It's riveted around the outside with a nice level of detailing, and I think you'll agree it has a really interesting shape. If you're interested in getting this file for 3D printing, it's going to be available on the Patreon as well as the Cults page. And if you did like that video, please do hit the like button, it helps share it around, and have a great day.